And if they do not comply with what the minister has set up, they will not get what is called a compliance certificate. And without a compliance certificate, these businesses will not be able to tender with government.
President Cyril Ramaphosa has signed the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, now the Employment Equity Amendment Act, into law. Joining me to unpack this piece of legislation and some of the possible consequences is Martin van Staden, the Deputy Head of Policy Research at the Institute of Race Relations. Martin, thanks very much for being with us today. Could you tell us just a little bit about the main takeaways from this piece of legislation? What exactly is it driving at achieving?
So South Africa has had the Employment Equity Act since 1998, and this has provided effectively that employers must draw up employment equity plans for their businesses, and that is effectively to say, how am I as an employer going to increase racial representativity in my business? How can my labor force more accurately reflect the population's racial demographics at the top, middle, and junior levels of the company? So that's been around for a long time, but the provision was that employers effectively decide their own targets according to the circumstances that prevail in their business. So it was voluntary compliance. However, there was a very, very strong encouragement from the state, and this also linked with BEE, which is a little bit different than affirmative action, but effectively it wasn't entirely voluntary in the way that one would expect. Now, what this new amendment does, because I'm sure listeners would have heard the government complaining about the slow pace of transformation in South Africa's economy relentlessly over the last few decades. What this does is it effectively takes that discretion away from employers and gives it to the Minister of Labor, who is now empowered to determine these so-called targets, which is a euphemism for race quotas, to determine these targets for any sector or any part of any sector of the economy and any economic region or any part of a region, and to differentiate them. So this is effectively an open-ended discretion for the minister to set race quotas for every single conceivable profession and business in South Africa, and to enforce compliance with their targets. So employers now must factor the minister's targets into their employment equity plans. And if they do not comply with what the minister has set up, they will not get what is called a compliance certificate. And without a compliance certificate, these businesses will not be able to tender with government. So there will not the ability to have contracts with government, which is unfortunately a large part of our economy, will fall away. And unfortunately, what I expect to see happen is that a lot of companies will be required in their own value chains, their own supply chains, to ask their suppliers for compliance certificates. Otherwise, they themselves will not benefit. So even if you as a business do not want to contract with the state, your clients might say, listen, in order for us to work together, you need to have a compliance certificate. Now, of course, there's also certain fines in terms of the act, which have been around, but now they take on kind of a new meaning. If you fail to submit reports or you fail to develop a plan, you can be fined quite a bit of money, as we saw a few months ago with the Dis-Chem controversy, where Dis-Chem said, we have to do this or we'll be fined. That was effectively, they wouldn't have complied with their own plan. But now as things change, you will not be complying with the minister's plan anymore, and then you could be fined for that. So that's broadly what the act does. There's one redeeming provision, I guess, and that is that businesses with fewer than 50 employees, that is 49 and below, do not have to comply with the Employment Equity Act's affirmative action provisions anymore. So there's a slight liberalization, there's a slight removal of red tape, where if you're a small business, you no longer have to develop an employment equity plan or implement targets. So that's one small redeeming provision, but I'm not sure that it redeems the act as a whole.
Martin, let's say one accepts the premise. Even there, I find it difficult to move that far, but accepting the sort of premise behind this piece of legislation, and then thinking that a specific bureaucrat, and not just, we're not focusing on the current labor minister, but the person of the minister of labor at any given point in time should have this kind of discretionary power to decide these sorts of outcomes. I mean, he could decide the hairdressing industry in Tembisa, for example, isn't transformed enough, quote unquote, according to his sort of requirements. I mean, the leap to think that that would achieve any sort of good transformation that one wants. I mean, that sort of good diversity and that is the freedom of association. What do you think is behind that sort of leap to think that giving any particular bureaucrat or person in government can achieve sort of ideal outcomes?
Yeah, look, Chris, Friedrich Hayek pointed out decades ago in the middle of the previous century that there's this thing called the knowledge problem. And it's effectively that central planning committees or bureaucrats in government, not only do they not have the requisite knowledge or information to comply to centrally plan an economy, they could never have that information. So it's not just that they don't have it, they could never have it. Now, this was an insight that I think won Hayek a Nobel Prize in economics, and has been built on since then. However, communists unfortunately did not take this to heart. The current Minister of Labor, Tula Nkezi, is the Deputy National Chairperson of the South African Communist Party. Communists have unfortunately rejected the notion that the government cannot plan the economy. They embrace the idea that, in fact, government can, if they get enough data, they get enough reports from employers and so on, then the minister can sit down, apply his mind to the huge mountains of paper before him and say, okay, this is the appropriate racial requirement for this sector or this profession or this region. It's nonsense. It's going to lead to I mean, we have virtually no economic growth currently, but it's probably going to lead to significant economic contraction. A lot of businesses, even though the act makes it effectively an offense to try to avoid becoming a designated employer, like if you try to downsize your business to 50 and lower, or you try to handicap yourself so you don't grow past 50 employees, that's illegal. But unfortunately, there's real life economics where this will happen. Businesses will, unfortunately, start capping their growth at that 49 employee ceiling. And I'm sure various other loopholes and strategies will be employed in the commercial sector to try and lessen the impact of this new change to the Employment Equity Act. Unfortunately, South African labor law is getting so burdensome, some of the most burdensome in the world, that businesses who come here from abroad and businesses that are established here simply want to limit their exposure to South African labor law, and as a result to South African labor. And with one of the greatest unemployment crises in the world, I think we're now at almost 14 million people unemployed. There couldn't be a worse time for us to make the labor environment even more unattractive to business. And that's what we're doing. And it's all based on this, unfortunately, socialistic command and control economy perspective, which we should have known for a century now, is simply not real. It doesn't work, and it's only going to lead to economic harm.
And Martin, then just finally a bit on the constitutionality or not of this particular piece of legislation. In your view, does it mix, as it were, with the Constitution, or does it go very hard against some of the sort of core tenets or sections? Are there any particular ones that you want to highlight that could be used in possible arguments or cases against this amendment?
Unfortunately, Chris, there's narratives that dominate in South African legal discourse that something like this is perfectly constitutional. Our courts have kind of implied that government may engage in racial engineering, which I think, as a legal scholar, is totally wrong. And the Institute of Race Relations has sent letters to government to express our views that this amendment is unconstitutional in various ways, and that it should therefore not be adopted. It has now been adopted, and I am sure that various organizations are going to attempt to challenge the constitutionality of the amendment. If the Constitution had in mind that government is allowed to racially engineer society in this way, way, it would have simply said so in the way that it does for the judiciary and in the way that it does for the public administration. But it does not say so. And as a result, if you look at some of the principles of legal interpretation, you have to come to the conclusion that, in fact, the Constitution prohibits the government from engaging in racial engineering. And that makes sense given South Africa's past. We had government intensively try to racially engineer South Africa for many, many decades. And the Constitution really was meant to be a break with that every individual should be able to determine their own actualization, their own destinies, their own economic affairs. That is what the Constitution fundamentally was meant to represent. And this bill and the act that it amends really just goes against that whole spirit. So I would say, Chris, this is a very unconstitutional piece of legislation, and listeners should expect that there will be a multi-pronged challenge from various organizations, I'm sure, against it in the coming days and weeks.
Thanks very much for watching. Let us know in the comments below your thoughts on the Employment Equity Amendment Act. Is this the kind of thing to fix the economic problems and woes that we're dealing with on a daily basis in South Africa? Until next time, this has been Chris Hutton for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.